I do see the bell, and I wonder in our lives how many times we ask God to speak to us, how many times we ask the presence to announce themselves, to step forward, and then actually when they do, we do not like it when they really ring the bell. We want the bell to be rung on our terms, not God's. We want God on our time, not his. Welcome to Jawbone. So it was the mother of the lad that first realised something unusual was coming into this world, because she dreamt, and in the dream a star just fell into her mouth. And it was only a few days after that she realised she felt unusual. She realised that a spark of light was growing in the lonely croft of her hips. And as the Olavs say, the bards say, the chief instructors of poetic grace and wit, they say the same thing. She's up the duff, she's up the duff, she's up the duff. Kieran's mother was up the duff. St. Kieran is the one that I am talking about, of course. Now, St. Kieran was born and he had a big Christian heart and he had a big Christian soul, but it is undeniable that had he been born a few generations earlier in Ireland, he would have been a druid of some kind. And he had a few druidic chops around him that, to my way of thinking, were not devilish in any fashion. One day, he's a lad, isn't he? He's, under 10, and he's wandering along and he's caught up in bird song. A lot of the early monks are all caught up in bird song because birds are secretly angels in disguise half the time. Well, swooping down from a tree is a hawk, and the hawk picks the bird up. It was a blackbird and was settling to break its neck, a nosh on it. Well, that's when Kieran does the spooky thing that Kieran can do. His mind kind of breaks all normal conventions like like a star, like a spark of light, and flies up out of his body and lands, surprisingly, into the consciousness of the hawk, where he reasons with the hawk that the thing to do, the noble thing to do today, would be to return the blackbird to its original branch and let the boy live, let him live, let him live. Astonishingly, the hawk breaks all hawk-like traditions, turns round, drops the little startled blackbird on the branch and flies off. Well, people saw this and they were kind of impressed, but they weren't actually that surprised because this was the kind of thing that Kieran would get up to. There was just something about his atmosphere, something about his way in the world that attracted animal presences, attracted birds, attracted the best kind of uncanny. And when he was older, when he was a monk, he attracted a monk. He attracted steely-eyed Patrick of the many conversions, the great monk himself. And Patrick turned up and he gave Kieran a gift. He gave him a bell. It was a small bell, and he said, "This is called a dreaming bell. And when this bell rings, this is the place you're to build your community. This is the place where you are to establish in Ireland, this place with no towns and no cities, just a lot of wild bush. You are to establish your settlement, your monastic place. But who knows when the bell will ring? You can't ring it yourself." That's an important lesson for all of us. And with that, Patrick trotted off to have a word with the snakes. So you can imagine that for a while you could argue that Kieran wandered around some of the prettier areas of Ireland. Maybe he spent a little time in what we now call Connemara, or down in Dingle, or somewhere on the Kerry Peninsula. Maybe he was over in what became Dublin. But in all the kind of more pretty spots, the bell didn't ring. He'd look at the bell, he'd try and will the bell to ring in the way that the hawk, he'd had access to the mind of the hawk, but nothing would work. Until he found himself right in the centre of Ireland, and it was a very unpromising place he was in. It was a place of glowering, maleficent, is that a word? Maleficent? Not magnificent, that's for sure. It was a place of unusual and unpleasant intent. It was kind of swampy. There were dark fairy tale trees. If there were any birds, they seemed to be crows. That kind of thing. There was a low-level mist. Well, what do you think happened? I think you know what happened. I think you know that, to his horror, that was the place where Patrick's bell started to ring. It was a bright, happy, jubilant sound, and it could be argued that Kieran actually grabbed it and tried to muffle it. Like a phone, you know, when it goes off in the theatre. But you can't muffle a spiritual bell, although there is many of us that have tried. Well, after a while he gives up. And he sits down and he makes a fire, and that bell is still ringing every now and then, just in case he's got the message. It's sending him out a little kind of braille message or a Morse code, you know, this is the spot, this is the spot. And he looks round in this little bit of scrubland, and to be honest, it seems that there's a lot of eyes looking on him in the darkness, and some of them, you know, you do wonder if they would wish you harm rather than good. But Kieran had pluck. And the next day he got to work. As usual, the first thing to do is to make prayers and then start to cut hazel wands and build yourself some kind of shelter from which you can conduct communion and sermons and the rest of it. But there is absolutely no population in this place. There's no crack in this place. There's no joy in this place. And actually, joy for the early Irish Christians is quite present. There's a jubilance in them that you don't always get in more martyr-heavy cultures, because there is no martyrdom really when Christianity arrives in Ireland. It arrives on the tip of a tongue rather than a spear. Green martyrdom is actually going out and doing what Kieran's doing, but we can argue that's very different to red, to the sacrifice of your life. So there's a lot of joy in Kieran, but there's not much joy in this place. But he gets to work anyway, and he's humming and he's singing and he's talking some of the psalms under his breath and then above his breath and out loud. And in the place he starts to kind of confirm or consecrate the place in the stories of the Galilee Druid. And little did he know, but looking at him from out of the very nearby tree line is a boar, a big tusked boar with small suspicious eyes, but with a big beating heart, and a boar that just happens to love stories. It could be argued that this boar, if it had swum over from Ireland, would be called Tic Truth. It could be argued that this is the same boar that gored the thigh of, any number of heroes, actually. Tristan, poor old Diarmid, up on Ben Bulboon, he came to a sorry end. A few others. This could always be that boar, but maybe that's the pagan version of the boar, and this is going to be soon the Christian version. Because the boar became interested in the stories and the songs, and he began to sit by the fire, and he'd listen to a slightly terrified Kieran relate these stories of the Nazarene Druid. And soon the boar is helping him. Now, the boar, as your first student, is nowhere that any monk would have in mind as their ideal beginnings. But after a while, there is a wolf helping them. After a while, there is a badger helping them. After a while, there is a fox helping them. The first presences in Ireland to gather around Kieran are animal presences. The first ones to let God into their heart and Christ into their heart are animals. Very sweet. It's a very sweet story. Now, over time, just like it would be for a human, you know, the teachings of Yeshua, it kind of polishes you in a way, and even amongst your many befuddlements, bit by bit, you can grow more human or better or deeper, or more animal-like, more creaturely. But one way or another, the fox wasn't entirely remodeled yet. And one day the fox stole one of Kieran's shoes, and it went, because it was so leathery, the sandal, you know what those leathery, disciple-y sandals are like, and he chewed and he chewed and he chewed. But who was watching from the bush but the badger. And the badger, is kind of officious, and, he had his little clipboard and he went and reported, I have to say. He snitched. He snitched on the fox. And so Kieran went to him and he said, listen, man, you probably do need something to chew on, but I really wish it wasn't my sandal. And, the contrition of the fox, it was awful. He wept big fox-like tears. He put himself out on a wilderness vigil in the forest. He wouldn't come back. In the end, it was only by them doing some cooking and pleading and singing that the fox allowed himself to be forgiven and came back and lived amongst them. And it was a happy and a merry time they had together. Kieran, the one who could extend out into the north, the south, the east and the west of the natural places and the divine places and commune with all that really matters. And his friend the boar, and his friend the wolf, and his friend the badger, and his friend the fox. And as far as I know, in that place, which is everywhere and nowhere, but definitely in the centre of Ireland, they live and flourish to this day. What a sweet story that is. And I guess as I'm sitting with you, brooding on it now, the thing that I can see right in front of me, because when I'm telling these stories, I'm just reporting back what I see, really. I do see the bell, and I wonder in our lives how many times we ask God to speak to us, how many times we ask the presence to announce themselves, to step forward, and then actually when they do, we do not like it when they really ring the bell. We want the bell to be rung on our terms, not God's. We want God on our time, not his. I've been thinking recently about the signum crucis, the sign of the cross. And I must admit, for most of my life, I have seen that gesture. I've seen it as a gesture not of opening up to the universe like Kieran does, but of closing down or of warding off. Actually, it's an act of keeping evil at bay. And so I saw it more of a kind of a breastplate thing, less than a gathering in thing. And I realized that for myself, I don't want to do that. I don't want to live with a defensive form of Christianity. I want to reach out to the world that, as I said before, I still believe gives God a lot of satisfaction, even in its fallen state. There is beauty amok, even amongst it. That's all part of the paradox of living. There's an old Greek word, pharmakon, the poison and the remedy. That's what we find around us all of the time. Bits of poison, bits of remedy, and we have to cleave to the grace and lean in and, I guess as they say, discern, test the spirits of the age. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. Let's go back to the notion of the signum crucis. So if you make the sign of the cross like that, you are reaching out to the world, you are voyaging into creation. Another, of course, of the great heroes of the early saints is St. Brendan. You remember Brendan. Brendan in the version, St. Brendan, who goes to discover what they call the hidden country, what we now think of as America. Well, Brendan of Tralee, Kerry Brendan. Brendan, there is a story, although not everybody tells this part of his story, but it's the way I've learnt it. It's part of the storying tradition that I know, is that Brendan, when he was a young monk, was given a book. And within the book, there were pictures. And these pictures were of parts of the world that he had never been to. Now, Brendan was well travelled in Ireland, but he hadn't been outside of the country. Why would he have been, really, to any real degree? Maybe he'd been to a few islands around Scotland. But when he saw these pictures, which contained herbs and plants and animals and even colours that he'd never seen before, he panicked. It was beyond his knowing. It was beyond his ken. It was beyond everything that he knew and felt reassured by. And he panicked. And he grabbed this beautiful book and he threw it onto the fire. Later that night, an angel appeared to Brendan and told Brendan that the book had been a gift. The book had been a gift from the great mystery, and that book contained all these different aspects of the glory of God's creation. The book was a gift to open the imagination of Brendan, not to close it down, certainly not to make him threatened or defensive, but to open himself up to the largesse, to the cornucopia, to the conviviality of this enormous, extraordinary world. But the smallness had got into Brendan. The smallness had got into Brendan just like it gets into us, and he'd burnt the book. Now, because he was repentant, because he considered his actions, because he brooded on it, a quality is born in his failure that he previously did not have. He became a listener. He became a listener to other people. He wasn't famed for that before this point, but there was something in the humbling of his mistake that he meant he was much better at listening to others, because he's slightly heroic up until this point. Some say that his totem, the animal that travelled with him from this point, was a crow. It was a crow again, like Kieran's crow. It's the carrion bird. It's the bird you don't expect. But you remember when Elijah is out there in the desert and he's starving, and God is going to bring him something to eat, and he's waiting, and who knows, maybe he thought a gazelle was going to turn up or some much more illustrious figure, but he looks out and he sees moving across the sky the raven, and it is the raven that brings him the dark meat that keeps him alive. I think that is a deep image for Christianity at this point. Again, it reflects a kind of deepening. So I get sidetracked again. I talk in circles. The soul is always attracted to circles. Plotinus says that the soul always works in a circle, not in a straight line. And all my teachers do this, I'm afraid, so I'm inculcated in it. So Brendan is now a crow man. Brendan is a listener, and to be a storyteller, you have to be a good listener. And Brendan sets out to find the hidden country. He sets out, not knowing he's doing it actually, to find the images that he'd once glimpsed in this book and burnt. He now has to find, by an act of will, something he was once given as an act of grace. This is deep in the Grail mysteries, by the way. It's deep in many other stories. How do we locate by will something we once were given by grace? We kind of can't, but it's an interesting encounter anyway. And on his travels, do you remember that Brendan bumps into Jasconius, a deep whale, who takes him deep into the mysteries, the subterranean mysteries of the Christian experience. And then he goes to an island it has like a world tree on it, filled with birds that were once angels, and when they sing, it is the jubilant sound of a fiddle. And so he learns the high, ecstatic keening of Christian ecstasy. And then in this place of the lower world of Jasconius Christianity, where from between that and the high place of the high angelic Christian experience, he finds the deep hesychastic silence of a group of monks who live on an island. And to get to the hidden country, he has to move between the three dimensions. The lower world, I love this, the lower world of Jasconius depth, the high world of the ecstatic keening birds, and the deep silence of the human experience that lives between them. And then, and only then, and then by travelling in circles, does the bell ring, the dreaming bell, and he finds his way to the hidden country. Let us all send a voice for our bell. And when it starts to ring, like Kieran, let us have the courage to dig in and begin the work. Hmm.